Welcome to the Overflow Worship Podcast, where we want you to thrive in the ministry God has called you to. We truly believe that God's placement has purpose, and we're here for you with encouragement and tools for the journey.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Overflow Worship Podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Olson. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited about our guest speaker today, or our podcast guest. We are just really grateful for the blessing that he has been to the ministry of Overflow. And really, he's become kind of our resident Overflow AV guy. And we met a few years ago, and we'll get into that a little bit more as the podcast goes on. But I'm just excited to welcome the president of NLFX Professional, Ben Stowe. Thanks for being here, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be your resident AV club guy. So,
Yeah, well, I love how God works and how he writes our stories so much better than we could ever do it ourselves, and how we just kind of connected through a mutual friend a few years ago, and it's grown into this really cool relationship through the ministry of Overflow, and just how, your heart for the church and your heart for equipping people is just so evident as you come to the conference every year and pour into people, and it's just been really special. So we thank you because we're really grateful.
well, it's been a real pleasure. I told you the first conference I was there, when I saw the people that were there, it really resonated with me that these are people who are pouring themselves out, and they're serving their congregations, and they're brave enough to step behind that mixing console for a service, and I thought, wow, this is such an opportunity to give back some of the abundance of blessings that I've had, and certainly my own path and career has been the result of many people who've given of themselves. So I would say I've probably gotten as much as I've given, just because it's so rewarding to be in that room with them and to see their hearts and their enthusiasm for technology, and I've really enjoyed it.
Well, that's exciting to me. It's always inspiring and a blessing to me when I cross paths with other people who have a similar passion for it. Obviously, I have a huge passion for it. And so when someone else is excited with me, I'm just like, yay, this is so great. Ben, why don't you take a few minutes and share with our listeners just a little bit about yourself?
Well, we've covered the important stuff. My name is Ben Stowe, and I'm a nerd, so that's pretty well checks all the boxes. But as you mentioned, I'm the president of NLFX Professional, which is a company that provides sound, lighting, video, and communications equipment and musical instruments. I always forget to say that, which of course that's probably my favorite part even. One of the areas that we serve is house of worship, of course. I was just talking to somebody else the other day about this, and they asked about my career path having started really fundamentally with electronics, and they said, but it seems like it always follows music. And I said, yeah, it definitely does. Music is sort of the thing that kind of drives it all for me. Not that there's anything wrong with other electrical engineering, but definitely this is where my passions are. And again, that's why it's so exciting to be sharing that with people who are brave enough, like I said, to step behind the mixing console. And I don't know if you saw this recently. I don't know if you ever see like the Babylon Bee, sort of the satire.
I haven't.
Oh, it's kind of like the Onion, which is a satire site, but church related. And there was an article recently that basically said something like, nerdy guy shows up and immediately is assigned to the soundboard or something,
Yeah.
Your only qualification is wearing a Star Wars shirt, which I am wearing a Star Wars shirt right now, by the way, but
that's amazing.
So, I think that's what happens. We have somebody who goes, oh, well, you're kind of you're kind of a nerd, right? Yeah. Okay, good. You're our new sound guy, or sound girl and a woman, whatever. And so, with basically no other qualification, there they are, and I think it's just wonderful, and it's awesome to see them grow as sound engineers and grow with their musicality, and of course help the people that are pouring of themselves on the stage too. People like you that are talented musicians, so.
And it can be such a beautiful thing and a team, a beautiful team of working together between the soundboard and the stage. And you get to you work with a lot of musicians, a lot of different people all over the country, probably the world too. I don't know all about your travels, but it
Yeah,
seems like you're
worldwide. Yeah.
yeah, and it seems like, it's just so special and so cool that as much as you travel and as much as you know, run sound for venues all over the place, then you come and you bring that to the local church and you share what, God has allowed you to experience and learn to really just come alongside of the church and help. And I just love that. I think that's such a beautiful thing. And so I would love to start the conversation as we kind of talk about what it looks like to empower our volunteer sound techs. You kicked it off great with saying, someone walks in the door with a Star Wars shirt on, they're like, "You're the new sound tech, welcome." And it's funny, but some of those stereotypes, I guess, are kind of true. We kind of,
Yeah, it's
we're
not
just
far
like,
off, right?
no, it's not. And it's also like, you're young and you said you like music, so you're going to be the sound tech. And that's great when we have willing people who are like, okay, sure, I'll serve wherever. But then how do we empower those people? And when you and I chatted on the phone about this podcast, you said something to the effect of, really coming alongside of them and understanding that, we're all volunteers. How do we empower each other? And so I just wanted to ask you, when you step into a situation where you're teaching new volunteers, new sound techs, and you're kind of coming alongside of them to say, here's some tips for you. Where do you start? Where do you start the conversation? Do you dive right into like the faders here and these here and the frequencies, or, do you start kind of broad picture and, yeah, just walk us through that.
Well, I think it depends on, the nature of the class, but I probably, when I was younger, I would have just dove right into the technology. And as I've grown, I've begun to realize that's not secondary, but it's complementary, and
Mm-hmm.
what you really just kind of keyed on there with empowering people. Um, you know, Here's some examples. So, in my profession, I have the wonderful opportunity to work with Grammy winners and Dove Award winners, and the people that are on the stages that I'm working on are, among the best in the game. And so, frankly, it makes my job really easy in some ways. Uh, and in fact, just the other day, I was saying to somebody, I said, I don't think I can make a bad band sound good, but I can make a good band sound bad. So, so my job is to make a good band sound great, or at a bare minimum, not make a good band sound bad. Uh, and there's a level of expectation here. When you have professionals on the stage, you have to be a professional as well. And so there is a professional decorum that exists between, the people on the stage and the people supporting them. And they can have a high level of expectation, but so can I.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think part of that is about, when you get into the church situation, I kind of start the class by, saying, okay, anybody here who's ever been paid to do sound, raise your hand.
Mhm.
And generally nobody raises their hand, you know,
Yep.
and many of these churches, now there are certainly churches that have paid musicians and they have paid sound techs and all those sorts of things. But more often than not, we're working, particularly at Overflow with smaller congregations, a lot of volunteers, people who are doing this out of love, out of a desire to serve and contribute. And so, to point out that the musicians aren't being paid either, you know,
Yeah.
and so we have to kind of come together in this process. The old saying about, honey and vinegar and, flies, and I'm not calling musicians flies, but, certainly helping people to understand everybody's role in creating the process, helping guitar players
Yeah.
understand about, stage volume if they've got an amp and that sort of thing, and
Mhm.
finding ways to preserve their tone, but also preserve the overall integrity of the mix. And so that's kind of, I call it my board side manner. Uh,
I love that.
Thank you. I don't think it's patented. I think you could probably use that. So, but to just help everybody understand, what we're doing here today, and it's difficult sometimes because if we take a great deal of pride in what we do, that isn't necessarily bad. But if we become prideful, then it is.
Yeah.
and it's sort of a distinction in there somewhere to say it's okay to really want to be a great musician or be a great sound tech or to, to help contribute to the worship experience. But fundamentally, it is a worship experience.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the whole point is to help people get closer to God. And
Mm.
as a friend of mine who's a worship pastor said, he said, God doesn't need the help, but the people do.
Yeah. Huh, I love that. That's so true. And as long as we can keep that in the forefront of our mind and kind of keep that the main filter that we run everything through, it really does change everything else. It kind of, if we start there and run everything else through that filter of like, this is our purpose, this is, got to keep the main thing, it really shifts and changes our attitudes and thoughts about everything else because we've started there. And I love that. I think that's so true. So
You know,
as you
uh,
oh, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say probably the best place to tell a secret is a podcast that'll be distributed everywhere, so seems like a great place to say something you wouldn't normally say to anybody, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but I was thinking I was at a Christmas Eve service several years ago, and I won't say where or anything like that, but there was an individual in the congregation who was singing a hymn as the whole congregation was singing, but one in particular kind of stood out, not really in the best way, I mean, just really was not. I'm not sure how many keys. I'm not even sure if they were on any key. They might have invented a key. I don't know, but. And my critical ear of sound kind of picks up on these things, little nuances, and my first thought was sort of abrasive, like, oh my goodness, this sounds terrible, like, oh my gosh, what is going on here, what a travesty, and then I and again, that's what I do professionally is sound. But then I took myself kind of back a step and I looked at where I was, just another child of God here celebrating the birth of Christ. And I thought, first of all, I can't sing at all. So who am I to talk? I mean, I am a lousy singer. I just lip sync in church, but second of all, I thought, I bet that sounds amazing to God. I bet that sounds so good to God. And so I think, kind of bring that with us as sound engineers too, particularly volunteers. First of all, we're not, if we're a volunteer sound person, we're probably not that great, and that's okay. And the musicians aren't necessarily that great. That's okay too, because it's we're not there to cut records, we're there to praise God. So
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this difficult conversation that we either have with each other or inside of our heads that as church ministry, musicians or sound techs, that well, we got to pursue excellence, but it can't become prideful. But we don't want to be distracting because we're trying to be so good and showy, but we don't want to be distracting because it's terrible, like from stage. And so there's this interesting like conflict and I talk about this with a lot of people at a lot of the workshops I do with worship teams because it is a real thing. Like, where's that line? How do we pursue excellence and not let it become something that we're arrogant about? And then the flip side, not getting to a point where we just don't care. It's like, it's just,
yeah,
it's just church, because it's not that either. And so my job and your job too, from from the sound tech's perspective and mine from the musicians and vocalist perspective, is to help them kind of find that spot where it's acting in humility, but realizing it is a high calling and, it is something that we want to honor God with. And so, when you work with sound techs, how do you encourage the pursuit of excellence? How, like, when you train them, or if you're chatting on the phone with somebody or you're in a church doing something with some volunteers, what are some tips that you could give for our listeners and that you've used in the past of how do we pursue excellence in the area of sound? Maybe it's practical, maybe it's fundamentally what comes to mind?
Well, the first thing I always try to tell people is that, Rome wasn't built in a day.
Yeah.
You're not going to leave a 90-minute seminar as a professional sound engineer. This is 25 years into my career, and I'm still learning a lot. I still encounter people who are much better engineers, and they inspire me and they frustrate me at the same time, but that frustration comes because I want to be better. And so, number one is to just sort of give them patience, to say this is like riding a bike or tying your shoes. There probably was a process that was difficult for a while, but then it became second nature. And two, to after you give them patience, to also give them boldness, to say, you have to be unafraid of the console. You have to be willing to step up to it. I'm not a big fan of the saying "fake it till you make it," but that's sort of, to say,
Yeah.
look, you've said you're going to do it, so now go do it. And it's hard because I think other people who don't understand the challenges sound techs have, I was just thinking about, it's much harder for the musicians maybe with the pride thing, because you are on stage and people are looking at you. Nobody
Hmm.
really looks at the sound tech until something goes wrong. Uh,
Exactly.
but that's kind of the only time we get acknowledged, is when something goes horribly wrong. And
Yes.
so, that can be a lot of negative reinforcement. And so to just kind of, give them some boldness and some support for that,
Yeah.
and then give them a little excitement and say, listen, when things click that first time, that really dial in a kick, or when that tone of that guitar is just so sweet, you're gonna think about that all day. And then, of course, you have to worry about not being too prideful, right? But it's
Yeah.
okay to celebrate those little victories. It's okay to
Yes.
say, yes, we got that. I think as far as the fundamental things, so those are the psychological things. The first thing is just say, one, give yourself patience, give yourself
Hmm.
time, be willing to make mistakes, and all that leads up to what is fundamentally critical for musicians as well, or really anything. If you want to be good at something, you have to practice. You have to
Yeah.
do it. You will not get better uh, by not doing it. You
Yeah.
must do it. And as you do it, you will get better at it. um, Again, like tying your shoes or riding a bike, or anybody who is in sports or plays music. I mean, it's all, anything you do, you're going to get better at it if you practice. um,
Yeah.
Except me in singing. I don't think there's any way I could get better at singing. But from a technology side, there are just a couple of really key things that are important to me, I think. One is uh, understanding the purpose of what you want to do.
Hmm.
Why are we about to turn a knob? Is there some purposeful outcome we want for that? Certainly things like low cuts on vocal mics are sort of a given. Some things like that. But other than that, little changes, little mistakes.
Yeah.
I recently had the pleasure of doing sound for Jackie Velasquez, and her husband
Mm.
was playing guitar with her.
Cool.
And I as he played, and it came through during sound check, I got the talkback mic, and to go to his ears on stage, and I said, "Hey, guess what I did to your guitar?" He's like, "What?" I said, "Nothing." Sounded so good. I'm just going to leave it alone, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Cool.
little changes, little mistakes. If you start turning a bunch of knobs, you could dig yourself a pretty good hole. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of, maybe that whole concept of less is more, like just less is more. And then you can kind of just learn in increments and learn kind of step by step, little step by step. And I love that.
yeah, your mixes will get better as you go. I mean, if there's one thing I
Yeah.
would tell everybody to master, it's gain structure, which is probably a
Okay.
topic in and of itself. And it's funny when I say gain structure, I mean, people look at me like I'm, speaking a foreign language. But, we're just talking about the electrical representation of the acoustic signal as it comes through our gear. And it's very
Yeah.
important to start at the beginning of that process, because if we have it wrong somewhere before it comes into the board or at the preamp, we can't fix it anywhere else. Once it's
Mhm.
wrong all the way through. And so that would be one of those critically important things, I think. But
Yeah.
yeah, like you said, sometimes less is more, and you can kind of build on the fundamentals. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so great. Yeah. You say foreign language. It made me think of, like, man, it was probably 12 or 13 years ago. My husband and I had just gotten married, and I was doing some continuing education, and I was taking some online classes through Berklee College of Music on the East Coast. And I did like a recording technology kind of focus. And I had to take a class on like frequencies, and I had to learn all about them. And I told my husband, I'm like, it's like learning French. This is just gonna be the end of me, because we had to listen to white noise and be able to identify, which frequency they had boosted and, all of that. So when you say foreign language and gain structure and frequencies and mixing and all of that, it just makes me think of of that, because it is, but it's also, you know, it's some of those things, probably not the extreme that I had to go through, but those things like gain structure and all that are just so important.
Yeah, you say middle C, I say 261 hertz, you say
Exactly.
A4, I say 440, whatever. But really it
Yeah.
is, I think that's pretty 201 stuff for a sound person, but that's really when you start getting comfortable with just the basic fundamentals and you can start digging into those things. And there's some great tools out there now. Most modern digital mixing consoles have spectrum analyzers and things on them, which give you a visual representation of the sound. So
Okay.
you don't have to hear that feedback and say, "Oh, I think that's 1.3K." You can look down at the
I'll
mixing
tell you.
console and it's got a little stripe on it saying it's right here.
Yeah.
And some purists I think would say that's cheating. uh I say, look, if you've got the tools, why not
Yeah.
use them? I mean, goodness sakes, this isn't about pride, like you said.
Yeah.
Use the tools that are right in front of you. So
Yeah, absolutely. So from a worship leader's perspective, for me when I train teams and leaders, it's it's all about the music, and if they want to get better, then it's like, okay, well, you could take lessons, you could, go to this online resource, and there's so many resources out there now. But if a sound tech goes to their worship leader and is like, "Hey, I want to get better at, my skill as a sound engineer. I really want to serve this church well, but I want to grow." Obviously there's conferences and that kind of thing, but what else are there tools out there other than, obviously, you just, like you said, you got to do it. But they don't have a mixing console in their basement. It's at church. So are there some kind of out of the box practical tools that could help our sound engineers who want to grow?
yeah, I think there are. Nothing beats putting your hands on a console.
Yeah.
And of course, a mixing console without a band isn't much good. But
Right.
nowadays, you can record these things in multi-track. Most digital boards, we can play this back in multi-track, just like we did at your conference, where we took a
Yeah.
live band that had been recorded and played it back through the consoles and let people mix a live band, even though the band wasn't really there. And so, the benefit here is they can do that with their own band in their own space, on their own board, in their own sound system. And it just requires some time when you can get into that worship space when nobody else is in there. Uh,
Yeah.
and I guess if your worship space is so busy that there's never any time for a sound person to get in there, that's a real blessing. Your church is obviously
Yeah.
doing something right.
Yeah.
But I think, certainly, my church, there's plenty of time to get in there if you need to. Also, there's an abundance of resources. There's so much out on YouTube. I think one thing that we have to kind of bear in mind is it's probably like if you go to YouTube to learn how to play guitar.
Hmm.
One, you have to play guitar; you're never going to learn. But two, not everything you see should be taken at face value. And
Yeah.
so the nice thing about this is it is artistic. And if you put 10 sound people in a room, you'd probably get 11 different opinions. So, you know, you can, or maybe 20, I don't know, but you can,
Yeah.
you can watch these things and say, well, I don't know if I agree with that, but I learned something, and maybe
Hmm.
you do agree with it, or maybe you create something new. But there's an abundance of material out there. There's articles you can read. There's fellowship. Uh, I love festivals because
Hmm.
so many bands come together and so many sound techs come together. Just because we're all performing in the space. But many of us have known each other for a long time, and so it's kind of a family reunion of sorts. And I think you kind of know, right? And you go
Yeah,
play a festival, and
totally.
you're like, "Oh my gosh, I haven't seen you for a year. How you been? And how's
Yeah.
how's everything?" And so when one of us is mixing, usually there'll be a couple other sound people around, just kind of hanging around because it's what we do, and because we really don't have anything else to do, I guess. And I had a good friend who's a sound guy out of Atlanta who was behind me as I was mixing a band at a festival. And he says, "Oh, man," he goes, "that really sounds good. That sounds really good." He goes, "I wouldn't have done it that way, but it sounds really good." And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
it's just sort of, I mean, everybody kind of reads between the lines on that. That there is an artistic nature to this.
Yeah.
So anyway, I kind of tangented off of saying, you don't have to do it the way you see it on YouTube, but you can learn things
Yeah.
from it. if you want to train your ears, which I strongly recommend, there is an app called Quiz Tones, and
Okay.
I believe you have to pay for it. I don't get any commission out of the deal, but you can download this app, and you can start with very easy, just pure sine wave tones. What frequency is that? It's multiple choice, gives you 4 choices. Um, and then it can get much harder, where you can start applying EQ cuts and boosts to a guitar
Okay.
or something and trying to peg
Cool.
what frequency was boosted or cut. And it can get into like thirds of an octave. And, unless you're the chosen one, you're probably not going to go right to that level.
Yeah.
And if you are, please don't tell me, because it took me a long time to get good at it. So just leave my pride intact, what little of it I have.
We
So.
will do that. Yeah, that's really cool. I love that because I don't, since I'm not a sound tech, I don't know good resources. And so it's always nice to hear stuff like that from someone that I trust, that it's reputable and useful and all of that. That is really awesome. And I think that's just really practical and beneficial for our people who are listening, that you don't, you want to be on the board, but if you can't be on the board, there are a few other things that you can be doing to be proactive, which is pretty cool. So,
It just takes
I guess,
initiative. That's a key
yes,
thing is, and
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No, that's
the
great.
scenario you laid out was where the sound tech is, asking for those resources. And I think that's fundamentally important.
Yeah.
uh, Take the initiative to look for those resources, because they're out there. Of course, our mutual friend Doug Gould likes to tell a
Yes.
story of the time he was brought in to fix a sound person. He's like, I don't know what they wanted me to do, like, lay hands on them or what.
Yeah. Yeah.
you know. So I guess that's nice too, if you're a worship leader and you feel like your sound person could benefit.
Hmm.
Here again, probably a gentle approach.
Yeah.
You don't want to say, boy, you're terrible, we think you need to get some training, because that
Yeah. Here's some conference money. Go find one.
yeah, exactly. But maybe you could say, gosh, we've noticed you've just been getting a lot better as a sound person, and we feel like you might be ready to take some future steps.
Yeah.
And two ways that are leading a person to training. One will inspire them to do it. The other kind of defeats them a little bit.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's all about empowering our people. And today we're talking about empowering our volunteer sound techs. And, I was having a conversation with somebody just last night, and she's a worship leader. And I've been coaching her just for the last year on growing as a leader and that kind of thing. And she ran into an issue with lyrics. They were doing a Christmas Carol. It's a less familiar song. And so the lyrics crew didn't know which verses she was doing. And there's just kind of this miscommunication that happened. And as we chatted about it, I said, one thing that I always try to do, if there's a really awkward situation and you're on stage and that there's something seriously going wrong in the tech booth, whether it's a sound tech or the lyrics or whoever it is, to really make sure that they feel a part of the team, because you're the leader. You don't want to say, like, give them the eye.
Yeah.
What are you doing back there? But to even sometimes, if it's really awkward situation and everything's kind of falling apart, just saying, you know what, guys, this is not their fault. This was my fault. I miscommunicated about what we were doing. Or just saying, hey, we don't have lyrics right now, but that's not their fault. I'm just going to tell you what we're singing, just to kind of dissipate that and really make the tech team feel like they are valued and they're part of the team too, and not just like, well, they screwed up back there, but we didn't screw up here, like,
Yeah, it's
then
not a
there's this.
contest, and it's not
Yeah.
and in fact, professionals really set the tone for how to do this. I just had the pleasure of kind of accidentally stumbling upon Debbie Campbell, who's Glenn Campbell's daughter, singing some of her father's songs, and she was kind of a guest performer. And I wasn't working at all. I just happened to kind of be in the area, and I heard it, and I thought, oh wow, let's check this out. I do love music, and the band actually started playing the wrong song, and they went a few. Well, I mean, I think half of them were on one song and half were on another song, and they went a few bars, and they're just like, oh, hang on, hold up, And
Yeah.
they looked at each
And it
other and they
happens.
laugh, and then they hit the reset button, and that was the end of it.
Yes.
It was, sports analogy is another one here. Of course, it's playoff football time, and that means I'm very busy coordinating wireless frequencies for NCAA games and that sort of thing. But if you watch where a kicker misses a kick, and they really only have one job, right? Kick
Mm.
the ball, or a running back fumbles, or a quarterback throws an interception. Um, if you watch when they go to the sideline, probably what you see is their teammates encouraging them, pat them on the helmet, pat them on the shoulder, say, hey, we'll get the next one. They're not saying, well, you're terrible and we wish you weren't on this team,
Yeah.
uh, because to err is human, and
Yeah.
stuff's going to happen, whether you're a musician or a singer or a worship leader or a sound tech. Uh, and sometimes technology happens.
Hmm.
I had a mixing board crash, a digital board crash in my own church. And that was very frustrating for me, because everybody in my church knows what I do for a living. And I don't normally run the soundboard there, because I go there to worship, and I love our volunteers. I love that they're there so that I can be with my family and worship and not work, because that is
Yeah.
my 9 to 5 job, right?
Yeah.
So, but in this instance, our 2 volunteer sound techs were both out of town, and they said, would you mind covering the board? No, I don't mind at all. And of course, I was training in our new volunteer coordinator, and she's already terrified of this mixing board. She's about a 70-year-old woman and had never seen a mixing board in her life. And so this was, this digital board was intimidating, and doggone it, of course it crashed. And so pastor starts talking and nothing's happening, and took me a few minutes to get the board restarted. And, after a restart, just like a computer, life is good again, the old tech mantra,
Yep.
unplug it, plug it back in. Right.
Yep.
And, I was really glad it happened to me, because I have enough sound guy arrogance to know this wasn't my fault, and
Yeah.
so I was frustrated at the incident, but I didn't feel like I had done something wrong, whereas I think our volunteers might have been like, oh my goodness, what did I do?
Yeah.
And so, I was kind of able to shake it off a little bit. And afterwards, the pastor, I'm lucky, we have kind of a nerdy pastor too. He's kind of a nerdy guy, so we get along pretty good. But he said, what happened? And I said, well, our mixing board has a hole in it. He said, it has a hole in it. He said, why does it have a hole in it? I said, well, a hammer fell on it. He said, a hammer fell on it. I said, yeah, I was trying to get sound back, and a hammer fell on it. Now it has a hole in it. He of course knew I was joking, and he started laughing, and,
Yeah.
and I said, no, I really have no idea. It just locked up, and so,
Yeah.
we reset it and we moved on, and that was that.
Yeah. And I think it's really encouraging for everybody to hear stories like that from, whether it is the local volunteer coordinator or it's somebody like yourself who runs sound professionally, that sometimes it happens and it's okay. And we just kind of gotta shake it off and keep going. And
Well, how many
it's easy
times
to
as a
say.
musician have you seen that, a guitar string
Yeah.
breaks, or I saw the bottom head of a snare break one time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when does that ever happen? But it happened, of course, in the
Never.
middle of a song, and so what do you do? I mean, stuff happens,
Yes.
and sometimes those are the best moments, honestly. I think there's a beauty in imperfection too,
Yep.
I love that about live music, that every time you do it, no matter how good you are, how perfect you are, every time you do it is truly unique. So I think
Yeah.
we can celebrate, the imperfections, and again, if you're losing your stuff over a guitar string breaking on stage, or if you're just coming unglued, because somebody played in the wrong key, or got off tempo,
Mhm.
uh, maybe that's not the right place for you,
Yeah.
or maybe it is, and the rest of your team needs to help you, through that, and again, empower and support and say, look, we're here to worship God,
Yeah.
I mean, it's okay. God is totally cool with that,
Yeah.
still sounds beautiful to God, like I said earlier,
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Well, I think that's a great spot to kind of end our conversation, and just as we, pursue excellence, but then we can celebrate our imperfections, because we're not perfect people, and that's okay. We're humans, and we need to realize that, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect for it to be beautiful to God, like you said. So, Ben, thank you so much for taking the time today to just share your wisdom and experience with our people. I'm really grateful, and I know that they're really blessed. So, thank you.
Well, I am blessed and I'm grateful. I never would have imagined or dreamed when I started this journey 25 years ago that I would be helping others, and that's truly humbling. I think it's a ministry of sorts, and
Yeah.
I recall so distinctly, and this kind of brings us back to where we started. I recall so distinctly when somebody told me, well, you're going to need a mixing board. And I
Mm.
said, what's that? I
Wow.
mean,
Yeah.
we all start somewhere,
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we are grateful for your willingness and just your abilities to serve and your willingness to do it, and we're all blessed because of it. So thank you. And thanks everybody for listening. We hope that you have a great rest of your week, and as always, know that we're here for you. If you need anything, you can reach out to us. You know how to find us. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you for listening to the Overflow Worship Podcast. To stay up to date, please subscribe for the latest episodes and information. To learn more about the ministry of Overflow, visit overflowworship.com. If you have questions or prayer requests, we would love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@overflowworship.com.